Welcome to episode 3, season 2 of the Altogether Show. This week we're joined by Dror Poleg, the founder of Hype Free Crypto, co-founder of Real Innovation Academy, and author of Rethinking Real Estate. Dror is also a speaker, instructor, and New York Times contributor, using his platforms to focus on the future of work, money, and cities. And like any entrepreneur, he's been through the ups and downs of starting things and seeing them through, and he shares those experiences with us. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Here we go. Dror Poleg, my man, welcome to the Altogether Show. Great to have you here.
Thanks, Eric. Great to be here.
So, this is about personal finance. The podcast is, but it's also about really interesting, at least I think, human beings. But the way I like to start is to give you the opportunity to tell us in your own words who Dror Poleg is.
Sure. Happy to take a stab at it. So I spent 2 decades of my career as a private equity real estate executive and as a tech entrepreneur and as a partner in a digital media firm. These worlds sound like they're unrelated, but somehow they were related for me. And I spent part of the last decade trying to bring them together. So I wrote a book about the future of the built world, the future of real estate, our offices, our homes, our shops, all of these changes that we've seen over the last decade, and particularly in the last 2 years. And basically, these days, I spend most of my time just writing, giving talks, and teaching. And that splits into 2 different worlds again. So one is about the future of the built world, where I train and speak to some of the largest investors in the world, banks, technology companies, real estate firms, about what they need to know and understand about how offices are changing, homes are changing, cities are changing, sometimes whole countries are changing. And on the other side of it, more pure tech, I teach a course called Hype Free Crypto, which aims to introduce people from other industries into what's going on in the crypto world, and introducing people from the crypto world into all sorts of valuable and useful problems that they can solve with all their skills and technology, instead of just trading photos of monkeys. So this is my main focus all day, and all of this is really based around just my writing. I write every week or a few times a week a newsletter. Every now and then I write for other publications such as the New York Times and others. And out of the writing flow all sorts of income streams and businesses as I see fit. But it all comes back to just being a writer, I guess, in the end. So that's the short answer.
So I'm going for an even shorter answer. If I ask your wife to describe Dror in 3 words, what does she say?
She would say I'm probably a Mossad agent, and she has no idea what I do or how I make money.
what you do. So, I mean, that's a great segue. Where were you born, Dror?
So I was born in a small country in the Middle East called Israel. Spent some of my childhood in France, and then lived in a few other places later.
What did your parents do? And I think this is important. It's not just what did your parents do, but what was life like growing up in Israel? Because when when we tie things back to money, our childhood is such a formative part in our
Mm-hmm.
life that it plays a formative role in our life, and in terms of how we think about it. Do we think about it? How important is it or not? What does it mean? So I'd love to understand what growing up in Israel was like, and sort of what impact that had in terms of an economic impact for you, and what influence did your parents have on that?
Sure. So I was born in 1980. People think of Israel today as like startup nation and modern and fun. But back then it was really a developing country, still quite socialist in a lot of its institutions. And it was a very simple place. We didn't have a lot of imported goods. We didn't have a lot of goods in general, I think. So I grew up not really thinking too much about money, especially in my early childhood. All of the people who went to school with me, there were only public schools. We all had more or less the same cars, wore more or less the same clothes. Yeah, there's some wealthier than others, but we kind of like the buildings look the same. We all lived around the same area. So I was never very conscious of that. especially early in my childhood. My parents were both public servants. So my mom at the time worked for like basically the national healthcare company. She was a physiotherapist. My dad was in the military. So, just middle or kind of like working class, like mid to low middle class, I think, in the beginning. And both of them came from very poor families that kind of lost everything during the war in Europe, came to Israel without nothing, remained relatively poor, but then my parents kind of like already did better. And I think throughout my life itself, they kind of moved towards the upper area of the middle class, but always remain, wage earners, not entrepreneurs, kind of people that believe, that you need to have stability in life, you work hard and everything will be okay, and basically don't try anything crazy. And a lot of the lifestyles that I discovered later were things that I kind of like never even knew about or didn't even think they existed or thought people would be crazy. And only when I got to know them, I kind of started to see the reason in the method in their madness, maybe.
It's kind of fun to hear you say, "Don't try anything crazy," when you're teaching a course called Hype Free Crypto to lots and lots of folks, right?
Yeah, I mean, my parents, my dad is the kind of person that you can call him and say, "Hey, I just got $50,000 from JP Morgan for consulting them on something for like 3 hours." And he'd be like, "Yeah, okay, but what about tomorrow? What's like, how do you turn this into like a, like,
But what are you really going to do? What are
yeah."
you really going to do,
So,
Dror? How are you going to make a
yeah.
living? Yeah,
And,
no.
and and I get it, based on their history and their traumatic history and losing everything again and again and seeing everything kind of taking away from them and their parents, the kind of striving towards stability is understandable. And of course, I have the privilege to do what I do because they built that stable foundation for me. So I'm not judging them, but it's just like really intensely different approaches to life, I would say.
So you're making this super easy. You're providing me with all the cues in terms of losing everything. I think we've gotten to a place, right, where first it was celebrity actors, and then maybe it was celebrity athletes, and then it was celebrity chefs, and we've sort of entered this age of celebrity entrepreneurs, and um, of course, any entrepreneur with worth their salt will tell you it's not about them. It's about a whole lot of people, and it's about
Mhm.
getting lucky when you need to get lucky. But um, I know that I also think it's important for people to understand that entrepreneurship is not a one-way street, and it's a not one-way curve up and to the right. And you had your own experience there. I was wondering if you would mind sharing some of that.
Sure. So a bit, maybe because of the upbringing that I had, I always had on the one hand like an entrepreneurial urge and generally kind of like a very independent urge of like, not fitting in, doing my own thing, following my curiosity, but at the same time that need to like, okay, let's do something reasonable, something that at least I can explain to someone if they ask me what I do. Uh, so I spent the kind of first first decade of my adult life, like my 20s, as a partner in different companies and as an executive in a private equity real estate firm, that gave me a lot of freedom, but I was still kind of part of an organization. But towards my mid 30s, I kind of got tired of that. I did reasonably well until then. And I had an idea for an app that I wanted to build, and which kind of grew out of some consulting work that I was doing in the
I think
technology
you were the
space.
only one with the idea for an app, by the way.
Yeah, right. Yeah. For this thing called an app in 2014, I kind of thought of, this app thing. And, and and I was also the only one who thought, okay, let's build a social network because people want to talk to each other. But the nice twist in what we did was that we wanted to build a location-based social network that basically only allows you to speak to people who are already really close to where you are. So trying to suck people back into the real world by acknowledging that their default would be to go into their phone, but then to try to show them, okay, there's something or someone really cool happening within walking distance. Why don't you join that conversation or walk over and see what's going on there? So something kind of like between a Twitter and Yelp and Foursquare, uh, and even Snapchat, because it was ephemeral, But at the same time, it encouraged you to use your real identity. So just like in the real world, you walk by two people, you hear them talking about something cool, you can kind of barge into the conversation, you're using your real face and your real voice. But once you walk away, you walk away. So you don't have to give them all your private information and then have a relationship with them forever unless you explicitly choose to. Uh, so I started building that thing, which grew out of my own adventures, landing in all sorts of cities all over the world and figuring out what's going on. And I saw that I'm quite good at it, but that most people just don't know how to talk to other people anymore or how to find local information. I realized that there's a lot of time sensitive and location sensitive information that is kind of out in the ether, but there's just no way to kind of bring it to the online world. Uh, that thing kind of ran ahead of me very quickly. Like I just designed it, didn't even know what I wanted to do with it, but we put it on the App Store. Apple featured it because they thought it was such a cool idea. So front page of the App Store for a few weeks in a bunch of countries, tens of thousands of downloads really quickly. And then I'm like, okay, I guess this thing is happening. And it also messed up my fundraising because investors really like to invest in PowerPoints. But once you have a product that is already being used, then they start like, okay, well, show me the metrics. And I'm like, no, we didn't even launch it. It's just like Apple featured us. I have no idea why. It was just on the App Store so I can mail it to some test users because they couldn't download
Right.
the like test flight. But I was kind of up and running, and that brought me to America 7 years ago because most of the users were here. So I was like, okay, let's go to America and see what's going on there. I was based in China until then. And before I knew it, I raised a little money. I started financing my own development of the product even before then. I started financing my own life in New York then for 2 years working on this app. And at some point, I realized that, wow, I burned almost all of my savings. This thing is not going anywhere. I raised some money, but it didn't raise enough before it was properly launched. And kind of now I don't have a good enough story to do anything else about it. And maybe more importantly, I don't want to run a startup anymore because I kind of got it out of my system. And I realized that, okay, not wanting to be corporate is one thing, but being an entrepreneur is not the only option that isn't a corporate job. And I kind of realized that I just want to write and speak and, do more like analysis and the kind of stuff that I actually do now. Uh, but when I realized it, I was already like literally broke. I was like, okay, I used to have a really comfortable salary and a driver and all sorts of other things, living in China. And now I'm
In
like in
China.
New
I
York.
want to say
Yeah.
in China.
No, in China, but I was making a
Yeah.
salary that would allow me the same lifestyle in New York. It was like I
Right.
was doing real estate. And now I'm like, okay, I live in like a tiny apartment in Chelsea. I can't even afford the rent in this apartment.
Right.
Like, how did I get to this? But there was not a lot of desperation involved because I think, I was always working on something or on 5 different things. And I kind of asked myself, okay, how could I, how did I fail? Everything I've done in life so far worked. So, and the answers I found, I mean, one, obviously a social media startup is a big bet to begin with. So the odds, you're at the hands of at the mercy of forces that you cannot control for the most part of it. But still, the things that I could control, I saw that the stuff that I was always very successful at in life always started from a very academic, analytic place of me kind of sitting down, doing my homework for a few months, becoming an expert in something before I tried to build anything, before I tried to sell anything. And with the startup, it was exactly the opposite. I had an idea for an app. I started running with it. I had no idea who is it for, how am I going to build it, what's the purpose. I just kind of assumed that the product will guide me,
Right.
or that the users will tell me what they want from me instead of me telling them what I assume they even want. Uh, so I gave myself a break and said, okay, you have a little money left. Take 3 months now and do exactly the same thing your way. So go and just do the homework for 2, 3 months. There's clearly an interesting thing here about online and offline and connecting people and creating interactions and physical assets and digital assets. You know enough about this, trust yourself, spend 2 months or 3 months thinking about it and trying to see if another product idea comes out of it or some amazing kind of pivot. I literally, went to Thailand, sat in Chiang Mai for a few weeks, like, no distractions, just me and my notes. And I said, you're not going home until you have like a deck that really has some clear thesis about, what is it that you have to say about this kind of space or problem. And as I was doing that, a bunch of ideas came up for businesses. None of them interested me, But the research itself was really interesting. I was like, wow, there's so many cool things happening, and there's so many implications that are relevant for, the biggest investors in the world, and people don't know about this. So maybe the only thing I can do is just share it with people and then see what happens. So I created this 70-page deck called Don't Think of a Building, which is kind of about how technology destabilizes physical assets in the physical world. And I just put it on LinkedIn, shared it with people who like read my newsletter. And very quickly it reached tons of people, and they started asking me to come in and help them with, they didn't really knew what, but they kind of said, okay, we have a lot of buildings, we have a lot of offices, we understand that there's something here that you can help us with. So why don't you come in and kind of like talk to
What
our CEO
year?
about
What
them?
drawer? What year is this?
This is 2017.
Yep.
And then I started like consulting and advising and kind of feeling my way and kind of telling myself, okay, this is not really what I want to do, but okay, it pays the bills, so let's see. At some point, I started writing a book about it because I realized that I have a lot to say and that nobody wrote a book. And I always wanted to write a book. I never knew it would be a book about real estate and tech, but somehow that was the first. And even within that process, I kind of iterated on what I thought was the most valuable use of my time. So I really kind of zoned in on like, okay, I just want to write and speak. I don't want to advise people. I don't want to get into operational things. I don't want to answer the phone when they have an emergency. I just want to come in, scare them a little, give them some guidance, give them a shortcut to an amazing thing that they can spend 2 years thinking about, but then leave them to it and not affect my lifestyle. Um, in the process, I got job offers, and some of them were quite attractive. But I really said, okay, actually, the fact that I'm so desperate already is why I'm not going to take that job offer, because I've made so many sacrifices to get to where I am, to get to a place where I live exactly where I want to be. I have the kind of time that I have for my relationship and my future family that now I have already as well. And spending my time on doing things that I really enjoy. So I'm just going to double down on that risk because I'm already in. So, I've seen the
Right.
edge, and now I want to get to the other side. I don't want to go back. And luckily it worked.
So
So,
let's take a detour real quick. When did you
mm.
meet your to be wife?
So I met my wife in February 2016. So a few months after I kind of landed, got off the boat here in New York. And we met obviously on an app, on a dating app. So we agreed back
It's
then
not
that
obvious
whatever
to me,
happened.
by the way. I'm 10 years older than you. I don't know from meeting on
Yeah.
the dating app, but I'm glad it
No,
worked.
but most marriages are a result of dating apps these days. But
I believe it.
I'm saying obviously just because I was running a location-based app to help you meet people
Ah, good point.
nearby.
Right.
So on our first or second date, I agreed. Told my wife, we have to agree right now that if we end up getting married, we will tell our kids that we met on the app that I developed. Yeah, let's remember it that way. So I came to New York, I built this app, and then I met my wife on the app that I built, and the rest is history. So that's how. But yeah,
What role has she played in your development, evolution, success?
so I'd say a huge role. One, she was part of the prize in a way. When I look forward into the future and I say, okay, I've made these sacrifices. For me, the sacrifices are not just like I left my job. I left China, which kind of symbolizes career at all costs. Go to an extreme place, be in an extreme business environment, make money, but kind of be far away from your country, be far away from a Jewish community. Uh, Generally, don't have a life other than your job, which was really fun in my 20s. I enjoyed it. I loved it. But I decided to change the priorities in my life, not just to like leave a job and have another job that in a
Right.
company that I own. And to me, my wife was kind of an encouragement to go in that direction, because I said, yes, my plan is actually working. Maybe that part of it in terms of business is not really working yet, but the part about building a new life is working, and there's clearly the building blocks are here in front of me. So I think that's one thing. Second, I mentioned that when I was kind of desperate, my response, and partly it's a flight, it's both a flight and fight response combined. But I was like, okay, let's go to Thailand, which is really cheap, less stressful, and think about business from there. But I only did that for a few weeks because I was in a relationship, so I had to come back. I think if I didn't have her, I would just keep going, and I'd say,
Uh-huh.
okay, let's just chill for a while and then see what happens. And so it actually added part of the pressure to come back and to fight and to figure this out, to say, okay, yes, New York is really expensive. I wish I could just bail out and go somewhere else, including even just going to Israel and saying, okay, let's just go back home and figure it out. But I had to come back to New York, and I think that forced me to like hustle even harder and to say, okay, you have to come back now. What are you going to do about it? Uh, and yeah, and then I decided, okay, I'm still going to try to do my own thing rather than going and getting like a boring job. And it worked. But yeah, but she played a huge role, and I think even things that happened later. Uh, with the birth of my daughter and then my son, each of those points was really, really important to me in terms of like cementing different lifestyle choices and priorities that I've made. And even COVID itself, like being able to spend so much time with my family, is something that it's going to be really hard for me to try and live any other way, let's say, at this point. Um, so, which is also very different from how I grew up, with a father in the military that we barely saw. So,
So a huge similarity between you and me in that we both met our future wives during um, what could be characterized, it sounds like, at least for both of us, our first entrepreneurial failures. I also met my wife during that period of time for me, so I get it, and I think
yeah.
um, what's often overlooked, besides the team that one builds with a company, is your own personal support system that you have, and how important that is in not just an entrepreneur's life, I think anyone's life, but especially
Mhm.
um, at many times in an entrepreneur's life. So you mentioned the kids. You have two young kids. I think 2 and 2 months. Is that? Am I close?
Yeah, my daughter is
Four
almost two and
months.
a half, and my son is going on 3 months. But I
Okay.
want to
So
say another thing about the wife thing. Just my wife will enjoy hearing this. But I think to me also the failure in business basically built a foundation for me to like commit and settle down. As strange as it sounds, I think before that I was really running at a really high speed,
uh-huh.
disregarding anyone in my path, including myself in some cases.
Right.
And here I think the kind of being kneecapped or chased in and kind of like being brought down to reality and kind of understanding that you can fail and that you cannot just pull rabbits out of your hat all the time, I think really helped me kind of understand, okay, you need certain relationships require commitment. You have to stay in the same place. You have to rely on other people. You need that. So I think that there's a strong connection between these two things and the timing of them. Yeah.
100%. So so you're married. You have a couple kids. And I think through time now, you have a certain philosophy with respect to money. And I'm not, and I asked you a question about this, so I'm not going to use the answer. I'm going to ask that you share with our listeners how it is you think about money and what role it should or shouldn't play in one's life.
So luckily, I don't remember my answer. I never do. So uh,
It keeps it
I think
interesting
one,
that way.
yeah, obviously, money is important. Anyone that tells you that it isn't is bullshitting. Either they have they never had any, or they have too much. Uh, the way I think about it is that it's necessary, and I always like to have multiple kind of defenses or revenue streams, or kind of like even completely different businesses in order to feel safe. I don't sleep at night if I know that I only have a job, for example. I need to have 3 or 4 different jobs in a way
Uh-huh.
in order to sleep well at night. But the scariest thing, the most important thing about money for me, which is partly scary, ties back to the answer that I gave you before to a question that you didn't ask about, the failure and the relationship that came out of it. That money sometimes creates incentives for you to live a life that maybe you don't really want, or to be a person that you don't really want to be.
You're hitting on the answer.
And sometimes by being successful, it kind of pulls you into all sorts of choices and locks you into all sorts of uh, lifestyles that at some point, if you're lucky enough and it breaks down for some reason, you really say, wait, I spent all my time and all my energy on this, and I spent all my skills on achieving that specific goal, why? And so I think that's the most dangerous thing about money is that if you have it and it pulls you in a different direction and into spending too much of your time on things that don't really matter. Um, and I kind of felt that even before I felt with the startup. I mean, when I left China and I left my real estate job, I really felt because I enjoyed my job so much and because it really used all of my skills, there's this bringing your whole self to work. I was like doing that, I was like using my language skills and culture skills and business skills and design skills and every kind of skill I use it, doing business in China and building shopping malls is like a very creative, very hands-on, uh, very intense human activity. But then I asked myself, did God give me all of these gifts in order to pressure the local representative of Zara or H&M to give me another 0.5% of their turnover in year 3 of our lease? You know, all my humor and all my charm and my intelligence and experience, like, is that what it's for? And I was like, okay, I want to do something else with this. And I'm still asking myself always, okay, is this, are you making the most of it, or are you just like, wasting your time? But back then it was really clear to me that like I didn't want to use those skills to manipulate people, to pressure them to play those games. And I realized, every business is partly a competitive thing, but there's a big difference between, doing private equity real estate and being a writer still. So
So
yeah.
you speak 4 languages, yes?
Yeah, I speak English, Hebrew, French, Chinese, and a little bit of a bunch of others.
Talented guy, 100%. So,
Just about
um,
what you spend your time on,
yeah,
people. Yeah.
it absolutely depends on what you spend your time on. So, by way of background education, and I'm going to try and bridge the gap here to hype free crypto.
hmm
You're an economic historian.
Yeah. So I did the master's in economic history at the London School of Economics. My BA is multimedia and communication. So kind of like looking at media theory and digital design, and also a minor in literature. And in high school, I majored in theater, which I think is the most important thing I've ever learned. So um, both for like self-confidence and kind of like thinking and dealing with people, and in general like having fun, knowing that even in high school you don't have to like do all the serious stuff. You can just choose whatever it
You were
is that
like
you
a
enjoy.
live events promoter, weren't you, in high school?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, that was my first kind of real job, to the
How,
extent that
how,
it's real.
how, how did I'm so curious. How did that start?
So Israel, I was talking about how kind of naive of a place it was, and part of it was just really safe for kids. So we would walk around in the streets and go to events and do stuff. And I think when I was 11, maybe it started. Like my brother's friend was like 14, 15. He was a DJ. And then he came to me and a few other friends of mine and said, hey, I can take this like cafe on like a Friday afternoon. And, if you guys bring some kids, we'll charge them like basically $1 or $2 in contemporary terms. And I'll give you whatever, a piece of the door fee. And then we started doing that. And then over time, it kind of became more of a thing. We started promoting bigger events and producing some of them. And I found myself in like cool places, in the jacuzzis and all sorts of places with the coolest DJs in the world and their girlfriends and stuff like that. Um, and and even that, by the way, it didn't start from writing, but writing had a lot to do with it, with taking it to the next level, because I started writing online about music and nightlife, and that connected me to a lot of the bigger other music producers and kind of venue owners uh, in Israel and even beyond. So almost every job I had started from me writing about it online, and then kind of people reaching out to me and then building something together.
Amazing. So, speaking of writing and promoting and hype free crypto, like at what point, as you thought about economic history as you know it, and the development of the blockchain and Bitcoin, and now the larger crypto environment that exists today and has really developed, you know, let's just say instances of it 10 years ago, starting to
hmm
pick up kind of around 2013, 14, and then really gaining some steam in 16, 17, losing a lot of steam in 17, 18.
Yeah.
And obviously now it feels like it is here to stay. At one point, did it become interesting to you And where do you think it's going?
Mhm. So interesting, it was almost from the beginning. So again, I have a master's in economic history. I'm very interested and very well versed in like the history of money and history of markets and the kind of long-term evolution of technology and its impact on society and the economy as well. So a lot of the kind of intellectual origins of Satoshi Nakamoto and the Bitcoin movement and later the rest of the blockchain ecosystem are kind of material that I was swimming in already before, Bitcoin was launched. And a lot of the dilemmas and a lot of the kind of thoughts about, the monetary system that they currently have and central banks and their role in positive and negative things. I didn't necessarily have strong or extreme views about it, but I was very interested in it. I understood that monetary policy and money is probably the most important thing in the world that people don't understand anything about in terms of its political impact and its influence and, on everything, on how we
Funny to
live,
say,
on
but
where we go
true.
to law. Yeah. Not just that you need money, but like the monetary policy itself ends up kind of guiding and impacting everything, including culture, including ideology. It's a super powerful and interesting and fascinating and abstract thing, which is the kind of stuff that I like learning about. So I was interested in it from the beginning. I'd say around 2014, when I was living in China, I had a lot of friends who were like big on Bitcoin. So I was kind of starting to look at it back then, and actually couldn't buy because I was in China, so I couldn't use the local whatever exchanges, and I couldn't use the foreign ones because I didn't have a bank account in the US. But I started kind of looking at it, and then 2015, when I was in America, I started buying bits and pieces, and 2016 to 17, there was a big wave, like the kind of previous kind of big wave of crypto. And a lot of that was focused around real estate and tech. So a lot of that was about how can we tokenize asset? How can we build a new title system? How can we build new lending and insurance and all sorts of other platforms that tie into physical assets? So I got to meet with hundreds or look at hundreds of decks and startups. Uh, and at that point, I actually shut it down. I was like, okay, there's so much BS, there's so much fraud, there's so many clowns who are like coming to me saying that they're solving a problem. But because I actually understand this space, I look at it, I'm like, okay. And then I'm telling them what's wrong, and they don't care because all they want is just to do an ICO and raise money. So then they're not really trying to even solve the problem. They're just like, oh, can we put your name on our website so that we can go and raise money? And I'm like, no. or, or even more commonly, we already put your name on our website.
Right.
And I'm like, no, please take my name off your website. So, but then as it kind of, even back then, I was writing about it, looking at it, trying to like think about it, seriously, even though I saw so much bullshit, because I thought, okay, there's something here. It's interesting. The problems it's trying to tackle are meaningful. Maybe something will come out of it. So I kind of wrote about it, kept looking at it. And then over the last 2 or 3 years, there was really, I mean, not just that the market came back, but more interestingly, all sorts of new apps and use cases and things started to develop, mostly on top of Ethereum and then other kind of non-Bitcoin currencies, uh, where people really started to build stuff that is interesting with smart contracts and even things like NFTs, which are mostly kind of silly and frivolous, but the infrastructure that powers them is interesting. And you can start to see the emergence of this new system for like digital copyrights or trading in virtual goods. Um, Plus the adoption and the money that comes in that kind of brings talent with it and brings users. And you're like, okay, this thing is actually relevant now. Still very early, still a lot of BS, still a lot of fraud, but there's something here. And at the same time, the problems that it went out to solve became much more acute and pronounced and kind of more mainstream themselves. So, again, things like monetary policy and like censorship and like, being able to take your money with you when you migrate. And so, we had a bunch of stories and a bunch of things, and we're living in the midst of one at the moment that kind of made them mainstream issues. They're not no longer things that like only cranks or extreme left or extreme right people talk about in all sorts of weird subreddits, but they're things that everyone talks about now all the time. And I kind of saw that, okay, something's happening here. My readers or just my friends or people in my network or even my parents' friends keep coming to me to ask me questions about it because they're like, oh, you kind of know about finance and tech, and can you explain this to me or that to me? And at some point, I kind of felt, all right, there's a lot to explain here. And it looks like I'm in a reasonable position to explain it, both because I understand it and also because I'm just a reasonable person and I have no dog in this fight. I'm curious uber alles, basically. I'm like, I'm just interested in understanding things, not like in convincing anyone of anything in particular.
Right.
And I'm in constant search of problems that are big enough and interesting enough that I can kind of dive into and never reach the bottom. And I found that in crypto, like a world that is so wide, so complicated, so full of noise, but with so much substance as well underneath the noise, and with all sorts of smart people from different disciplines. And it just keeps my brain going. And I saw that, I can create value for other people by introducing them to this world in an impartial way, not like trying to sell it to them or telling them which coins to buy, but telling them, hey, this is what's going on. This is what's interesting. This is what's not interesting. This is why it might work. This is why it might not work. But ultimately, I see it like the internet in the mid to late 90s. Most of the big names of that era no longer exist. So if you would have invested in them, probably not the best idea. Most of the ways we did things back then were terrible and stupid. But at the end of the day, wouldn't you want to like know everything about it back then, like I did when I was on the internet, in the mid 90s? So I see crypto in the same way. If you want to understand where the world is going, you have to understand it. You have to know what's going on. And even if it all kind of goes up in flames, whatever comes next is going to grow out of those ashes. So the earlier you understand, the better it is for you, regardless of whether this thing is going to take you there or something else will come up.
So I think there are a couple of, well, in one case an acronym, and in another case, I think an evolution of a word or a word amended just with a digit on the end that is penetrating the global vernacular. One is NFT, and the other is Web3. And you're writing about both, and I think for a lot of folks they'd appreciate understanding the connection between the two. Would you mind sort of sharing your thoughts on that?
Sure thing. So I'll start with Web3, kind of the umbrella term. So Web3 is basically an umbrella term that comprises a bunch of efforts to create a new type of web that solves 2 or 3 problems that exist in the web that we currently have. Those problems are as follows. So one, there are currently a handful of very large companies, platforms, that control most of our social interactions, data, and economic transactions. So I'm talking about companies like Facebook, like Amazon, like YouTube, even like AWS and Stripe. So these companies have a lot of power, which means that if they decide to deplatform any of us, then we're in big, big trouble because we have fewer alternatives that we can use. And the alternatives exist, but if you're off Facebook and YouTube and Stripe, then you're already in big
Twitter.
trouble. Yeah. Now, the original idea of the web was something that is more decentralized, more democratic, which is not necessarily feasible, but it wasn't what we have today. Now, the second issue is that even in the best of times, if, let's say I'm on Facebook, I'm on YouTube, I'm creating content, Facebook is making billions, I'm not being compensated for my contribution as a user. And most users, they contribute something to the platform's success. So this kind of contributes to a more extreme imbalance of or inequality, let's say. So here too, there's a question, okay, is there a better way to do it? Not necessarily communism and everyone will have the same thing, but is there a better way to do these things? And part of what makes it interesting is not that, Facebook or YouTube are like that because they're evil, they rely on advertising and they're centralized. But in a way, because the web and the technologies available, that's the best model that they lend themselves to. If they wanted to compensate each person every time they post something interesting on Facebook, it would be a very complex system with the tools that we use for Web 2. You want to send each one an invoice and get their bank details, and it just wouldn't make sense. The third point is that if you decide to move from any of those platforms, whether you're kicked off or not, you're basically leaving behind everything that you have there. So your relationships, your contact lists, your assets, even a simple very simple scenario where like I bought a video on iTunes or, a few years ago, I can leave iTunes, but the video stays with iTunes. I cannot take my media file or my digital asset with me. or I bought something inside a video game, I cannot take it with me and I cannot sell it. So it's not really mine, even though I paid for it. So Web3, again, is a bunch of efforts to try and solve a few of these problems. Now, it does that in a few different ways. One, it runs on a blockchain. Complicated explanation.
I'm not going to ask you to explain blockchain.
Yeah,
Instead,
but
what
what's
I'm going to say
interesting
is
about the blockchain,
if you want to understand blockchain, you got to take hype-free crypto. So
yeah, but what's interesting there is that it decouples identity, digital assets, and payments from the platforms directly. So basically, using crypto wallets, I can log into different websites, but the account is kind of something that travels with me between them. It's not something that is kind of locked into them. If I buy, for example, an NFT, which is, again, a kind of silly early use case of the technology, I can buy it in one website and I can take it with me and sell it on a different website. And it kind of travels with me. It's in my wallet. It's not stored by the website itself. It belongs to me. And of course, the payments are integral to the internet itself. It's as if like the internet itself, each person had an account or multiple accounts that you could pay to, that you could attach different files to, and you would travel with that account between different platforms. Now, it doesn't mean that platforms don't become powerful, but it kind of changes the kind of the relationship between users and platforms. And in addition, it provides all sorts of tools for like more extreme cases of, if you want to resist censorship, if you want to transfer money without asking anyone for permission, it facilitates that in some cases. So in a way, Web3 is bringing cryptocurrencies into the web and giving the internet its own native payments and also to an extent legal system. So an ability to enforce transactions between people and to allow them to buy and sell stuff more easily and to allow them to have more control over their information. Now, of course, everything I just described is the vision and how it would ideally work. It doesn't mean that it currently works like this. It doesn't mean that it always works like this. But that's what Web3 is about as a vision.
So I'm going to read something back to you that you wrote, which is that the web in its current state is like a city without public spaces. People can only interact in places owned by someone else, and a small group of landlords captures an oversized share of all economic activity. So in a nutshell, I think that sort of summarizes what you just communicated. But when I read that, I thought that's so spot on, so on point. But it raises a different question for me, which is if I understand what's happening. I don't know whether it's, you tell me whether it's with, on the NFT side or on the Web3 side or both, whereas the idea is to decentralize away from the platforms and to give everyone ownership of essentially their own information and their own work. As I understand it right now, we still only have two sort of trust layers owned by two different companies sitting in the back that everybody else is pinging for verification. Does that create some sort of concern for you, or is there a way around that?
So one, there's always going to be new centralization. So I wrote another piece called "The Conservation of Centralization," which is not, an idea that people have kind of toyed with in the past as well. But basically, once you turn one thing into a commodity, once you make one thing open and abundant, by necessity, something else becomes kind of more scarce, and people have to go through another kind of gateway in order to access it or enjoy it. As an example, the internet made information abundant, but it doesn't mean that everyone can always go and get whatever they want. They have to go through Google. So it created this amazing aggregator in the middle that, okay, you democratize something, but you also kind of set up a new king that is more powerful than any king we've seen before. So there's definitely that concern. And we're already seeing that, for example, the Ethereum blockchain, which a lot of those apps run on, you can say, okay, so this basically creates Ethereum as the next multi-trillion-dollar entity that is basically the most important thing on the internet, assuming that this vision comes to life. And that's a valid concern. The difference is that Ethereum is an open source project. The code is available to everyone. It's run by a group of developers. And a foundation that is kind of nonprofit and tries to support the development. So it's already somewhat of a different beast. It doesn't, again, I'm not naive about it whatsoever. So, I mean, I'm not going to say, okay, this is wonderful, problem solved, but it's a different approach. And part of what's interesting about crypto, I said before that it kind of gave the internet the kind of monetary engine that it needs in order to do more and take itself to the next vision. It's also true as far as open source code goes. So, open source has been a growing kind of movement, but it was always more of like, okay, we're just going to do stuff for free, and maybe some corporation is going to pick it up, and people are going to contribute just because they enjoy it, or they want the reputation. A bit like Wikipedia. People contribute a
Right.
lot to Wikipedia, but they don't get compensated. What crypto gives you, and NFTs play an important role in this, is some kind of financial system that enables you to compensate people and to build really complex incentive structures for large groups of people that want to come and pool their resources, both their time and their money, in order to do stuff and govern that activity in an automated way with smart contracts of saying, okay, a person that contributed 5% of something is going to automatically get a percentage of every sale that happens on the thing that they contributed to. You can build like these really complex royalty systems, a bit like we have in the music industry, but now much more cheaply
Oh,
and in a way that
I'm in Nashville and Music City. When you start talking music royalties,
yeah.
now like that's almost worse than healthcare. The other thing that happens in Nashville.
No, right. But imagine that you can just streamline it, that you don't have to like keep a manual record of things and then send people checks and then argue about them, but that everything is defined in advance, and most of it has to do with digital goods. So you know exactly what was used by whom, how often, who's supposed to get paid for it, and then everything just flows based on some predefined logic. That's a compelling vision. Again, it doesn't mean that it works for everything, but it basically helps you to coordinate the efforts of thousands of people in order to maintain those type of public goods. You mentioned before the example of a city without public spaces. To me, when I read what I wrote, the next question that comes into my mind, yeah, okay, but so we can have the government just step in and say, okay, we're going to clear this and build a park in the middle. But what happens if the people themselves want to do it? In the past, we didn't have really a way to do it. Today, you have these mechanisms that crypto provides that enable 20,000 people to say, okay, we're going to put $50 million together. We don't need to know each other or trust each other, because the mechanisms themselves ensure that nothing happens to that money unless the majority of us votes on it doing something. And then we can take it and build all sorts of kind of common goods ourselves uh, on the internet or beyond. And I think that's really the most interesting thing here. It empowers people, which doesn't mean that they're all going to do good things with that power. They're going to do also,
Right.
white supremacist rallies and buy. Also, people are already doing weird stuff with it too. But it's also going to give us a lot of power. So more than anything, it implies change and radical change, which is why it's important to study about it and understand it and help shape it.
So you are obviously referring to DAOs and
Yeah.
a group effort to try and buy the U.S. Constitution
Yeah. For
and
example.
and I think that's a great segue to what unfortunately, because I think we could talk for at least another hour or two. A great segue to when people talk about NFTs today, in the well, in the common language, people are thinking bored apes, right?
Right.
Um, what should people be thinking about in terms of NFTs and the role that they play in the future evolution of our economic society?
Sure. So I can read you a short description that I wrote
Sure.
just a few days ago. So, an NFT is a digital token used to track the ownership of a specific thing. So they're most commonly used to sell and trade digital art. So a creator can upload, an image, a video, a song, a text to a marketplace or something like that. And then people can buy that token. That NFT is a token that confers ownership of that thing, that says, okay, if you
So it
if you
could be a
own the
house.
token, sorry?
So it could be evidence of home ownership.
Yeah, it could be evidence of ownership. It could be evidence of anything. Now, what's interesting about it is that it fits into this kind of broader crypto financial system that enables you to do fun things with it. For example, like building a music royalty system, but building it from scratch, much more cheaply, much more automated, and provide access to many more people, and to use it on many more use cases, not just on for Taylor Swift, but for every clown that wrote to blog posts, he can already set up his own royalty system.
Yeah, and I take it you weren't referring to Taylor as a clown in that segue.
God forbid. Taylor is the queen. But another interesting thing is that it's not just the tokens. A lot of people say, okay, so you bought an NFT of a photo of a monkey. I can right click the photo of that monkey. Right, you can do that. And you can right click a lot of stuff in the world, whether it's illegal or not. But what's interesting is those tokens can be used for all sorts of other things. So they can confer all sorts of other rights. For example, if you own a certain NFT, that might give you access to a chat room with all sorts of people, or to a login to a data warehouse with all sorts of information that is relevant to you. Or you can use it as your profile photo on Twitter, and then Twitter will ping the Ethereum blockchain to make sure that you're the actual sole owner of that photo and not anyone else. So it's not just about the photo itself, it's about having this kind of digital token that can be used in all sorts of ways, and whoever owns that single token has all of those powers and nobody else has. So even if you steal someone's photo, just like you can steal someone's photo on, you can steal my passport photo, but it doesn't mean that if you swipe my driver's license in the airport, it's going to work for you. You need to have my actual driver's license. So it's a form of identification, right, as well. And again, you can tie all sorts of other rights to that NFT. If we speak about music royalties, you can say whoever owns this also gets 5%. Like I bought a Taylor Swift, let's say, monkey drawing. And part of the rights that I'm getting is that whatever Taylor sells online, I'm getting 5% of it because I own that drawing. So if someone right clicks the photo of that drawing, it's not going to give them that money. It's going to give me that money. So that's where the value comes from. That's where it becomes interesting. So a lot of the kind of noise that's happening right now, most of it is BS, but it's still meaningful because it helps finance the infrastructure and stress test the infrastructure for many more interesting use cases that are being built on top of it.
Dror, thank you for being a guest on the show. I loved having you. Looking forward to your continued and future success. And man, thanks for doing it.
Thank you, Eric. It was a pleasure.
The Altogether Show is brought to you by Alto. Alto knows that achieving true portfolio diversification means investing in more than just stocks and bonds. That's why Alto developed a streamlined platform to make it easy and cost-effective to invest tax-advantaged retirement savings in alternatives, assets like real estate, venture capital, and crypto that are outside of the public markets and available through Alto's growing list of investment partners. To learn more, visit altoira.com/altogether.